Gracias, Jeff. Thank you very much, Nicolas, with this surprise with Jeff Cross. So now let's go to our next speaker.
Es el momento de conectarnos con Madrid, España. Famosa por sus ricas colecciones de arte europeo con obras de Goya, Velázquez y otros maestros españoles en el Museo del Prado. Desde esta ciudad nos acompaña Pablo Ortuño, emprendedor, apasionado de las tecnologías web y constructor de productos web desde el 2009. Aprendamos con Pablo cómo integrar WebComponents con ngModel y Reactive Form.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes. Well, very eager to talk to you. Thank you so much for waiting. We are a bit late, and we know that it's late in Spain. So thank you so much for staying up and joining us. No problem. Great. So without further ado, we'll hand over to your talk. Great. I'll share the screen. Please confirm you can see it correctly. So we're going to start now. And the idea of this talk is, in principle, to talk to you about web components and tell you why it is a super useful tool, especially to lose that fear that everyone had about Angular. So we have form management, and on that point, it's important that this component can work perfectly. So two things: to teach you a series of details so that you can research on how to use them, and convince you that you don't have to be afraid because you can take advantage of them as much as you can. So the talk is not about just the Angular components, but I want to tell you that I am an entrepreneur and developer, and in this entrepreneurship phase, I've had to face a lot of changes and challenges. And the tools, it's clear, we love Angular, but sometimes we have to find the best for each project, and web components are a tool that we can fit into every type of project. So at the end, it's necessary to have knowledge of several types of technologies and do the best for the project. The truth is, as much as we love Angular, well, here is where we see the need of other types of systems and web components, because although we know that in the main aspects we're going to use Angular always, it's whether it's for a client or an application or service, we have to exchange these components. So with Angular, they're going to work perfectly. So with this framework and with the other priorities, or with Google, etc., we can do this. So this is the reality. Here, when I'm going to do a project, I always think Angular. So this is absolutely marvelous, and always it's worth trying. But Angular is our favorite. So for a long time, I've been trying to understand that this improvised meme is this. This is the web components. So what's the idea? To tell you briefly what web components are, to bring you into context, and to specifically say, well, one of the best things that we have in Angular is the forms, and how we can get the best advantage of the forms using Angular. So in the web components, in JavaScript, we have HTML encapsulated, and we're going to be able to share in different platforms, products, frameworks, etc. So here we have a standard in the web, which is very simple to use in other systems, and it's going to allow us that in the long term, it can work. Now, in Angular, we know that when doing a framework, you have certain commitments and certain things that you have to do. So therefore, many times, this is more simple in JavaScript to incorporate it to other projects. And In Angular, sometimes we find certain problems that make us go backwards. So what we're going to do here is to specify that this problem could exist with the forms and how we can do it simply. So the simplest way here is first to see what type of components are of interest. And in this case, using web components in Angular, this is a custom element module, and you can use it, but particularly a series of components which are inputs, sliders, pickers, selectors. At the end of the day, these are typical elements that we're going to use in the form and that we're going to need to validate correctly, because I was in a different talk talking about these forms, and it's important for these components to work perfectly and integrate with Angular. Therefore, at the end, we have to find the perfect union, the perfect point where Angular and web component work as one, and we don't have any types of problems. This would be the, the, the dream everyone's looking for, to be able to use this web component of ours where you can use the model without any type of problem, and where you can use the or reactivate and without having to worry. And this is an Angular component, or this is an external component, or whatever it is. The best way to understand how this works is to see that this, what we're doing here, is a series of directives that work on the concrete elements. So we forget sometimes that Angular has a source code that we can query, and that we should be able to, well, the best way to do this, let's go to the Angular source code. Let's see how Angular can make use of this model. So if we go to the Angular file, we're going to find a directive. So in this case, it's the one that is used by default. And we have a component or an ngModel. And if we go and open the browser, then it is in the form package. And as in this case, we know what are the elements that need to be fulfilled. And what we need to find is the selector. In the selector, we're going to see what components is going to act on. In this case, it's all of this directive on the input and different forms with an ngModel, text area, etc. What is this component going to do? Well, we have what we would have in error management for forms, etc. Generally, there are four things we need to consider, which are the value, which at the end is this component that we talked about. They have an internal value, and they compare to the outside. This is the value we have to solve in the form. We have the value, then we have an element in unchanged, which allows us to detect, and we'll have to communicate to see how much changed. The untouched, to understand if the document was touched or not, and disabled, which allows us to disable the command. So these four are the interface point that Angular is going to act with. So at the end, what we have to do is to say Angular, well, for these four values, you have to do it in this way. In fact, if we go back to the page of the official documentation in the code, we'll see that generally what Angular uses is basically what we have by default, the inputs. For the case of the input, it's going to use the value as an exchange value. For the untouched event, it's going to use blue, and it's going to use the unchanged for the element. This is very good, and in fact, it makes us see how it should be if we want to start. But the truth is that considering this, there are two ways in which we can interact with our web component. There's a simple way and a more complex way. The simpler way is easy. It's to say Angular, for my component, you're going to use by default the value. And what's this going to do? It's going to allow us to use the ngModel, but we have to consider our component internally, and it has to fulfill these requirements that are requested by value control. In this case, it would mean to have an unchanged element, a blur element, and an element where it has the value that's going to be. And if we comply with these three requirements, there won't be a problem. So what happens? Well, of course, our ngModel component doesn't always have to have these requirements. In fact, we can find it in a different way. And this is another way to do it. We can create our own control value access. So what do we have to do? Well, what are the components for our web component here and where it should act? At the end of the day, it's to say or to declare it in our ngModel in this new version. Now, of course, in the providers, we have to change the access value and, in the case, implement this control, which will help us to define a series of functions that are the interface we're talking about. One of the functions, the first one that we'll have to increase will be, or implement, will write on our component the value that the ngModel possesses, in this case of the form. So this is having access to the native element, and we'll have to indicate which part will be the value right there. A third step is to add that property which change. So if we have an error in the form, we have to disable an input. We'll have to say to this directive, well, this is our component, this disable is called this way. So fourth, the last two functions we have at the end, there's two things we have to tell, and it's to be able to use all the elements that we have, or an input is dirty, or it hasn't been touched, or there's a content. We need to specify what is the function of unchanged and untouched. In this case, what we're going to do is make use of the post and say, what will be the function of this component that will reflect those characteristics? Once we do that, then it will restrict that directive we're going to use. So if we have an example, a full example here, we can see that basically, and as a reminder, we've used a selector where we are going to put in all the components, in our case, that we have affected in this directive, and we are developing a design system through web components. And a best practice here would be that all the web components we do, all the forms, always have the same input and the same functions for these elements. So we can define all the components and simply to do override on these functions. In this case, unchanged or unblurred. Like we said, for changing the form and the function and the right value and disable space to have the writing of our components and the steps. So the final goal is to use this. Now, this comes very well at the end. And basically, the idea is that we can make total use of the web components. Angular as a framework has its restrictions, but that doesn't mean we can't use any other library or any other tool in a comfortable way. And these components can be exchanged in a tool, a framework, and at the end, you can have a package design system that could be growing, and we have to get all the potential in Angular. And with this, I close my talk. I expect to have adjusted to the time. Thank you all for listening to me, and I leave you now with my social networks. So if you have any questions, please contact me, and we hope it's been useful. Thank you, Pablo, for this excellent talk. Yes, of course.